Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is chapter 3 of my never-ending quest in slaying the demon that is autofilling one-time passwords with static passwords in my OPNsense firewall router. Just to recap the issue, the way that the OPNsense login page is designed is that, of course, you can autofill the username and password, but you can see what happens when I do that with 1Password. It says wrong username and password. Well, the password and the username are fine. The problem is, of course, is that I have 2FA enabled on that account, and I'm using standard Google Authenticator time-based one-time passcodes, and I have that in my 1Password. So the way that OPNsense wants you to enter that TOTP with the static password is you have to, if you look at their page here, you have to enter that one-time passcode before, and I guess after, I guess it does it either way, but you have to concatenate that with your actual static password. So as you can see, if your password was password and the one-time passcode in 1Password was that, you'd have to enter it in to the password field as this. So this problem spawned a big thread, which is still ongoing on the 1Password community forums, where a request was originally made 4 years ago at this point, that 1Password have some sort of feature that allows you to automatically do that for you. So I followed up to this thread because I thought about this and I thought, what would be a good solution to this? My idea was to create a dynamic password field for a given password entry in 1Password. And in this dynamic password field, you can actually create a new field that can actually reference other fields within the same vault item to generate a whole new password, and I call it dynamic password. And so I created this little mock-up where I say, okay, I want to create a new password that consists of the one-time passcode, the static password, and a pin code from this field that I created called pin code. And I got a lot of good traction from all the people in this thread. Many people said, yeah, that makes sense. That's how we should do it. And begging the 1Password developers to do something similar to that. Well, long story short, 1Password developers are basically saying, nah, we're not going to do that. We don't think it's important enough, and we're not going to do that. So that's very disappointing, but this is a very common issue. And in all fairness to 1Password, this is also an issue with Bitwarden. And there's a similar request on the Bitwarden forums, and turns out the Bitwarden developers also don't seem very enthusiastic about going out of the way to accommodate situations like this. Despite the fact that this is not a super huge edge case. Granted, it is an edge case, but it's not a gigantically small edge case because the issue occurs on other prominent sites like USAA.com. In order for me to log into my USAA.com account, I have to concatenate a PIN code with a one-time passcode token. And I also discovered recently that PyKVM, the awesome IP-based KVM tool, has a similar issue where if you want to connect to the KVM using VNC, if you have 2FA enabled on your PyKVM, you got to do the same thing. Append the one-time code to the password and then enter that as the password. So this is not just an OPNsense problem. So I made 2 previous videos to this where I came up with a workaround using Keyboard Maestro and the 1Password CLI tool to autofill these kind of pages using the 1Password CLI, which actually works quite well. The problem with that is that it's not an all-encompassing solution because while that may work well for a computer, it won't work on your iOS device or your mobile device. Specifically in my case, because I use an iPhone, I can't do this autofill trick on an iPhone because you can't run 1Password CLI on an iPhone. So in relation to the iOS problem, the good news is that I figured out a good solution for this. The bad news is that unless you're a super tech nerd, it may probably be more trouble than it's worth. But I wanted to show how to do this because I learned a lot of lessons in the process of figuring this out. Just a quick backstory. The way I came up with the solution was by accident. A couple weeks ago, my ISP went down. So, of course, my wife who works from home, she's yelling at me saying, hey, is the internet down? I'm like, I don't know. So the first thing I do, obviously, is try to log into my internet router and see what the heck is going on. When I tried using my trusty old Keyboard Maestro macro, it didn't work. And I'm like, why is this not working? I can't log into my OPNsense router using my Keyboard Maestro macro. And so when I investigated further, what I discovered was the 1Password CLI tool actually requires live internet access in order for it to work. Because when you make a request to pull something out of your 1Password account via the 1Password CLI tool, it actually makes a call out to the 1Password servers to get that information. And if you don't have internet access, it returns null or it returns an error. And that never occurred to me. So it was kind of ironic that in trying to log into my router to figure out what the problem was, I discovered that this 1Password CLI workaround was flawed in that respect. So I tried to figure out, how do I work around this? How do I get it so if the internet goes down, this still works and I can still use my autofill on my local network without requiring an internet access? So as it turns out, through my research, I found out that 1Password actually has a product, even better, a free product called 1Password Connect Server. And what's even cooler about this is that you can self-host this server on your local network. And you can use this 1Password Connect server to retrieve the secrets that the 1Password CLI tool would get for you, but in a much more cross-platform way. It doesn't require you to install the 1Password CLI tool on your computer. And a side benefit is it actually returns the information much faster than the CLI tool. So I used the 1Password Connect server to solve the problem of autofilling the OPNsense login, even though my internet access is down. So that worked great. After I did that, I realized, wait a minute, if I don't need the 1Password CLI tool to do this, I can actually use the same thing on my iOS device to autofill that OPNsense login password on my iOS device. And after a couple of hours of messing around with it, I solved the problem. So the good news is that, yes, you can now autofill your OPNsense login password with the one-time passcode automatically on your iOS device. The bad news is, of course, you need to set up the 1Password Connect server. And that requires things like having a Docker server on your network and all that kind of stuff. So it's not really for the faint of heart if you're not really a tech nerd who has a home lab and is willing to set up a Docker server. If you're not willing to do that, you should just hit stop on this video now because unfortunately it does require you to do this. But if you're the kind of person that is actually running an OPNsense router, chances are very high that you have the technical savvy to be able to do this yourself. So for whatever that's worth, because it is a very easy process to set the 1Password Connect server because it just you just have to fire up the server via Docker. So I will go through that process and show you how it works. Okay, so the first step in this process is that we're going to create the dedicated vault in your 1Password account. So you can obviously do that from the 1Password app, but I'm going to show you how to do it from the admin console in your web-based admin account. So you can just click the New Vault button here and give it a vault name, make it obvious like 1Password Connect Server Secrets, and just create the vault. So I've already done this in my account. I called it 1Password Connect Server Secrets, so it's clear what this vault is for. So as I mentioned, you're going to want to move any existing vault items that contain any kind of secrets or information that you want to have accessible via your self-hosted 1Password Connect server, and you're going to want to move them to this vault. So I have my OPNsense, got a demo account, my real account, and I also have some keys for image, my local photo management app. And so I moved those items to that vault. Okay, so that's step one. So let's go back to the 1Password admin page. Step two is you're going to want to create a Connect server. So click the Developer tab on the left-hand side, and then click on this Connect Servers option here. So click on the New Connect Server button here, and give your environment a name. So this is going to be the name of the server that you're going to use here. I'm just going to call this Demo Server. And then you're going to want to choose the vault that you want this server to be able to access. So to do that, you click Choose Vaults. And then select the vault that you created here just for 1Password Connect access. Obviously, you can actually make pretty much your entire account accessible if you want, but definitely don't recommend doing that for security reasons. So now you can click Update Vaults at the bottom here, and then click Add Environment. Set up your first access token. So this access token is basically the API token that you're going to use for whatever script or any kind of automation task that will need to access the information in that vault. So I will just call this OPNsense. And, you know, for home lab, I can just set that to never. But obviously, if you're in an actual production environment, you're definitely going to want to expire the key after a while and regenerate the token. And again, here, you're going to configure what vaults that token actually has access to. So even though you set up in the previous step, you can actually set up multiple vaults that the server itself can access. Here's where you define what vaults the token itself has access to. So you may only want OPNsense to only have access to a very specific vault. Even though you've configured the server to access multiple vaults, here is where you'll tell it, I only want it to access that vault. And in this case, since we only have one vault, it's the only option we have. And in almost all cases, unless you have a very specific reason, you're going to want to enable this as a read-only token. Click Issue Token. So now it's generated two things, very important things that are crucial to this process. First is this 1Password credentials JSON file. This is the credentials that you're going to upload to your Docker host that allows the OneConnect server to authenticate with your actual 1Password instance in the cloud. The second one is the access token that you just created for OPNsense. And there's options here where you can save these credentials in your 1Password vault. And of course, you should definitely do that. So for each one, click Save it 1Password. And in this case, you don't want to save it to this server secrets vault. You want to save it to a outside vault. This is privileged information. So for the credentials file, you want to save that obviously in a private vault outside of the actual vault that is accessible to the server itself. And then also you want to save this access token that we've created for OPNsense to use. So click Save in 1Password, and same deal here. You can save that into the private vault and hit Save. Click on View Details. And you can see now we've created the access token, we've got a demo server, and we have the vault that we only have read-only access to. And if you want to add more vaults, you can click Manage and add more vaults. But for this purpose, we're not going to do that. So now that we've laid the groundwork for what the 1Password Connect server can access, now we have to actually install and set up the 1Password Connect server. Just an addendum to what we just did, I forgot to mention that it's probably a good idea to create another separate vault just for the actual credentials for the server itself. So these are separate from the actual secrets that you want to have accessible via the 1Password Connect server API. In fact, I edited the vault description to be clear about what the purpose of each vault is. So my 1Password Connect server secrets vault is only for the actual secrets and the information that I want clients to be able to access via the API on the Connect server. On this other vault that I've called 1Password Connect server creds, these are the keys and the credentials files that enable the server itself to authenticate with your account. And this vault should be admin only. This should not be accessible to anybody else except server admins. And this is where you also keep the API tokens that you create for various clients. Okay, so move those two items that you just saved from that previous step and save them into this server creds vault. Okay, so the next step is to set up the actual 1Password Connect server and install the Docker container for it. So again, I'm not going to show how to set up a Docker server. I'm going to assume that you already know how to do that. You already have a Docker server all set up. So I'm going to SSH into my Docker host and go to my Docker folder that I've created. So there's nothing in there right now. This is a fresh Docker host install. I'm going to create a folder called 1Password Connect and then change into that folder. Okay, so let's go back to the 1Password Connect server documentation on the 1Password developer site. So if you click on this Get Started section here, if you scroll down, you can see this thing. They link to an example Docker Compose file. So just copy the link to that Docker Compose file, go back to your Docker host, and we're going to download that Docker Compose file. Okay, so if we list, there it is. So you could technically use this compose file as is. A couple things though. The default options, obviously they're going to default to 8080 and 8081. So if you've got any other containers running on your host with those same ports, you're obviously going to want to change that. One thing the compose files do not have, however, they don't have the restart policies enabled on them. So I want the 1Password Connect server to always restart whenever the Docker host is restarted or whatever, and only not restart if I specifically stop it. So I'm going to add the unless stopped policy, restart policy for both the 1Password Connect API and the 1Password Connect sync containers. And unless you have other specific things you want to tweak with this compose, you can, but you really don't have to. So that's all there is to it. You just save the configuration changes. Okay, so now that we've got the Docker Compose file set up, we need to add the credentials file for the 1Password Connect server to use so it can authenticate with your actual 1Password account up in the cloud. And so if we go back to the 1Password app where we saved those credentials into the Connect Server Creds vault, this is what the credentials file item is, the one you auto-saved. And it's a file called 1passwordcredentials.json. So we can just download that file locally, click reveal. Okay, we're going to copy this 1Password credentials JSON file to our Docker host. And we're going to upload it to the same directory that the compose file is. All right, so if we go back to our Docker host and list, and we'll see that our credentials are there now. One important thing to take care of here. So depending on how you've got your Docker host set up, the default permissions of the JSON file you copied over will be set to 600. You can see here read write. You're going to want to change the permissions of that 1Password credentials JSON file to 644. Otherwise, the 1Password sync container will not be able to authenticate with your 1Password account in the cloud. So now it's just a simple matter of starting the Docker container using Docker Compose. So just type Docker Compose up, and you're going to want to daemonize it with the -d option. And it'll pull the images, and everything is started. So we do Docker PS. So we have a Connect Sync container and a Connect API container running. And we're going to interact with the Connect API container via port 8080. So we can test to see if the Connect server is working. We're just going to send it a dummy request. So our Connect server is at, in this my case, Docker LXC, port 8080. And then the endpoint, we'll use v1/vaults. And every time you send a request to the API, you're going to want to send a bearer token, which is the key that you saved in 1Password. And we'll get back to that in a second here. But just send it this test request. So if you get a status 401 error and an invalid bearer token, which is obviously invalid because the token is not blah, 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 but it's showing you that the server is working and it knows that you've got an invalid token. So now we know that the 1Password Connect server is running. And that's really all there is to it as far as getting the Connect server running. So we'll move on to the next step. Okay, for the next step of the process, you're going to want to use an API client, something that you can use to send API requests to and get responses back from. Obviously, you can use things like Postman or Insomnia, things like that. On the Mac, I actually been really liking this Get API app, which is part of my Set app subscription. And I actually really like it because it's obviously a Mac native app. And it actually does something with the JSON responses that I really like that I haven't really seen any other tools do. And I'll show that to you a little bit later. But first of all, just to get started here, we're going to send a REST API request to the 1Password Connect server. So if you go back to the 1Password developer site, you can see the 1Password Connect API reference, and it'll show you all the endpoints and what they do. So you can refer to that if you ever have any questions about how to access the API. So the most basic call we're going to just do here as a test is to get a list of the vaults that we have access to. So this is the endpoint for that request. And this is a GET request, by the way. If I just hit send, and then we look at the return body here, you can see that we're getting the same invalid bearer token message we got when we did the curl command. And the reason why is because we're not sending it the proper authorization header. For the 1Password Connect server, it's expecting a bearer token as the authorization header. So where you get that from is you go back to your server creds vault, go to the demo server. In this case, we call it a demo server. So it's called demo server access token. So we're going to copy the credential, which is the API token or access token that we've created specifically for the use of interacting with OPNsense. So we'll copy that to the clipboard, go back to our API client, and then paste that in as the bearer token for this request. And now when we click send, now we're getting information back from the 1Password Connect server. So the /v1/vault endpoint will return each vault that you have access to. This is actually the specific API key. So what you're going to need to copy from this data is this ID. This is the UUID of the vault that you want to access. So you need the UUID of the vault here. See, copy vault UUID. By the way, if you don't see that, go up to your 1Password app settings, go to advanced, make sure that show debugging tools is enabled. And when you right click on an item, you can copy the vault ID. And you're also going to want to copy the UUID of the vault item itself by right clicking on it and going copy item UUID. All right, so that's the same information we're getting here. Okay, so we can see all the vaults that we have access to. Now, if we wanted to get the contents of a vault item, we will adjust our endpoint here. And so you can see here now the endpoint looks like this. You got v1 vault, and then you've got this, which is the UUID of the vault. So we want to paste that in. I've already pasted it. And then we got items. And then this UUID is the actual UUID of the vault item here. So if you right click on that and go copy item UUID, and then paste that in here, and then hit send. Oh, I forgot to, I'm using the wrong API token there. So I need to change the bearer token to that, and then click send again. And now you can see. So I mentioned actually the default view is this. It'll just spit out all this JSON. And this is what most API clients will show you, right? The thing I like about this Get API app on Mac is this JSON tree view, which really makes it a lot more readable. Shows it in a more kind of a indented table view without all the JSON braces and stuff like that. So it just makes it a lot easier for you to parse out the data you want. But what this shows is the information from this specific vault item, this OPNsense demo item. So you can see the field names here are username, password, one-time password, website. And it corresponds to these 4 fields we're getting here. Okay, so now that we know that we can get the secrets out of the 1Password Connect server, we just need to figure out how do we get this very specific information. In this case, we want the password and we want the one-time password code. And you can see there's the one-time password code. If I run this again, you'll see this number change. See, the number has changed. So every time you run this API request, you'll get the most updated one-time password code. Okay, so now that we know how to get the information out of the 1Password Connect server via the REST API, now we're going to integrate that with the iOS shortcut. Okay, so let's go back to JSON view here. So this is the actual raw JSON output that the API returned to us. We're going to want to copy this to our clipboard. Basically, in order for shortcuts to parse out this data, we need to give it the JSON path to the specific data we want to use. So I found an easy way to do that is to paste the output. And of course, this is kind of insecure if you're using real passwords, but just to show you the concept of how we determine the JSON path. We want to pull out the password. We want to pull out the username, which is demo here, which is the value. And we want to pull out the one-time password value, which is the TOTP field here. Okay. So just to cut to the chase, we're going to extract this information using these JSON paths. If you go back to here and use the JSON Path Online Evaluator tool, if we pass that JSON path here into here, you can see it's returning what we want. We want the username. It's returning demo. And then the interesting thing is if you do this one, so if you do this one, it returns the TOTP. And of course, the password as well. Obviously, if you've got your 1Password item configured in a different way, you've got different field names or whatever, you'll have to figure out what the correct JSON path is to those values. So now that we know the JSON paths that we need to get this data out of this API response, now we have pretty much all the tools we need to start building our iOS shortcut. So let's do that. So before we start setting up the shortcut, first off, I'd recommend that you do all the shortcut setup on a Mac. It's just because it's so much easier to do that using a real keyboard and a big screen and all that. It'll kind of drive you nuts trying to set this thing up on an iPhone by tapping and dragging. So I recommend doing this on your Mac and sync the shortcuts via iCloud to your phone. The other thing is that this shortcut actually has 2 dependencies that you need to download and install from the App Store. And they're both free, so that's the added bonus of this. But they're necessary in order for this to work. The first app is called Data Jar. And both of these apps, by the way, work on both Mac and iOS. So if you download them on Mac, you can also download them on iOS. But install this Data Jar. So what this Data Jar app is, it's an app that's actually made specifically for use with shortcuts. It's a way to store data, to write new data, and to retrieve data in a persistent manner and across devices. So we're going to use Data Jar to store some of the information that are required to interact with the 1Password Connect API. The other app is simply called Actions. And for whatever reason it doesn't show up because there's a lot of things called Actions, just search for Actions shortcuts and you see this app. So what this Actions app does is it actually adds, and it says right there, it adds a lot of actions for shortcuts that aren't shipped natively with the default Shortcuts app. So it includes a lot of cool, useful things. But one of the actions that this actions package gives us in shortcuts is the ability to parse data out of a JSON object using JSON paths. And it makes it very simple. If you didn't have this, it's very tedious to get information out of a JSON string using JSON paths in shortcuts. But this just makes it literally a single action process. So you're going to want to install and download those things first and do the same on your iOS device. So when you launch DataJar, you'll get this little window. Then you can see that there's some demo tiles here. And DataJar is basically kind of like a simplified database. It lets you store key and value pairs in any number of formats, just like a regular database would. So in this case, you can see the key name is coffee count and there's a value of 3. And what's great about this is that this is persistent data. And you can reference these values from shortcuts, just like you're accessing a database. And the nice thing about DataJar is that this stuff syncs via iCloud across all your devices. So if you have something that works on the Mac, it'll work on iOS and vice versa. So you may be asking, why are we using this DataJar app? The reason is that in order for shortcuts to access the 1Password Connect server, it obviously has to pass that access token that we created. That is effectively like a password. So what you don't want to do is hard code that token into any script or, in this case, a shortcut. You don't want to hard code that value into that. It's just a bad practice to do that. You might share the shortcut accidentally to somebody and not realize that your credentials are still in there. And when you're writing scripts like Bash scripts or Python scripts, the best practice is to keep credentials like that separate from the actual main logic of the script. Because let's say you committed your script to like GitHub or something. You're going to commit that credential to the public GitHub, which would be not a great thing. So best practice is to keep those credentials separate from the script. In the case of shortcuts, we're basically using DataJar for that same purpose. We're going to store the value of this access token in DataJar. So let's do that. Let's click Add Value. And for the key name, I'm going to call it this. 1Password Connect Access Key. And then for the value, we're going to copy and paste the access token as the value for that key. And then hit save. There you can see there's our 1Password Connect access key. And that's it. We're basically done with DataJar. The DataJar is really only there to keep that value separate from your shortcut. Okay, now that we're done with DataJar, we can start building the shortcut. So just launch the Shortcuts app on your Mac, and the Shortcuts window will open. As you can see, I got quite a bit of different kinds of shortcuts here. So I'll walk you through how the shortcut works, and I'll post a link in the description for where you can download this shortcut. So the way this shortcut works is that, first off, I click this little eye icon here. You're going to invoke the shortcut on your iOS device from the share sheet, which is that little icon there. So you want to make sure that the shortcut appears in that share sheet, and to do that, you make sure that this check is enabled. Everything else you can pretty much disable. So you click on the Privacy tab, and this is where you give the shortcut permission to access various things, either on the iOS device or on the Mac. And because Actions and DataJar are cross-platform in that regard, they show up here. So you want to make sure you give permissions to Actions, DataJar. I have Brave here because I was testing this out in the non-Safari browser. The caveat to this is that this only works in Safari, unfortunately, because of the way shortcuts works. But better than nothing. And you want to make sure you also let it send notifications as well. And here we want to allow DataJar to get the contents of the URL when you're sending it via the share sheet. So make sure that's set to always allow, and that's it. Setup you don't have to worry about. So the first action in the shortcut is we want to receive Safari web pages and apps. You click on that. We want to uncheck. Basically, we're only going to send it a Safari web page. Okay, nothing else. So only enable Safari web pages and make sure we're getting that input from the share sheet, as we can see here. And then there's a trap here that aborts if you don't send it anything. So the next action is get URLs from input. And we're going to get the URLs, in this case a single URL, that was input to the shortcut via the share sheet. So next we have this if statement. What this does is that if you try to run that shortcut on any other page, it will abort. Because obviously you don't want this thing autofilling on the wrong site, as the notification says. So this is what this if statement does. And if it's not 192.168.200.1, just abort the shortcut. Okay. But assuming that we're on the right page, we're going to go down to here. Now this action is a data jar action. The data jar action here is this get value action. And the value we want to get is from this 1Password connect access key that we created. So that's the value it's getting. Okay, after that, we're going to set a variable, call it OP API key, 1Password API key, and that variable is going to be set to the value that we got from data jar here. As you can see, the little line passes it through. So now we're setting OP API key to that value. So next in line is a dictionary, and this is basically a key and value pair. And here's where we set some constants for the things we want to access. And they're pretty self-explanatory again. Here, OP Connect server, you want to put the base URL of the 1Password Connect server. So our server is running on this Docker host on port 8080. So that'll be the value. Vault UUID. So these are the UUIDs we showed earlier when we were messing around with the REST API testing. Those are those same UUIDs. And then you add them here. So next, we're going to build the REST API endpoint URL from all this information here. And that's what this text action does. So you can see it takes the variable OP Vault UUID, it references it from the dictionary, and it just builds a URL. All right, so the next action is this get contents of URL. So this get contents of URL action is actually where we make the API request to the 1Password Connect server. So it gets the contents of the URL that this text action built, and we're using get as the method, and we're also passing the bearer key, which is up here in the OP API key value, where we got the value from the data jar key. So this is where we actually send the API request. And then from here, this is where that actions app comes into play. So actions, that actions package has this action called get values using JSONPath, which is very, very handy because it just allows you to parse that data with a single action, just like we did with the REST API client. So all you need to do here is get the values from the results of this action. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that JSON path to just get, in this case, the one-time password code. And then we're going to stuff that into a variable called TOTP. And then we go on to the next field, password, and do the same thing for the username. And we're saving them into their own variables here. Now the fun part is the last action. Run JavaScript on active Safari tab. So like the previous versions of this autofill method that I used using Keyboard Maestro, shortcuts can also fill out forms in the Safari web page. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We're actually targeting the elements in the HTML page here. And then we're going to fill the value with the variables that we got from the JSON paths, as you can see here. And here's where the magic happens. In the password field for the OPNsense login page, we're going to concatenate that one-time passcode with the static password. And we're going to fill that in automatically. And then finally, we'll click the submit button, and theoretically, we'll be logged in with a single click. Okay, now that we got the shortcut synced back to our iPhone, before we can start using the shortcut, we need to actually change one setting in the shortcuts configuration. So go to the shortcuts settings, and under advanced, make sure allow running scripts is enabled. If that setting's not on, the shortcut will not work. So turn that on, and let's launch Safari. All right, so here we are at my OPNsense login page. You can see the IP address is 192.168.200.1. So tap the share sheet button, and you can see here our shortcut is actually showing up in the share sheet. You tap it, and we're in. So the cool thing about the shortcut, the way we configured it, is it will only work on this site. If we go to another site, OPNsense.com, which is clearly not the same thing as OPNsense without an E, and we try to autofill the password into this website, we get an error because it's not the actual OPNsense site. And so there it is. I did it. I slayed the beast. You can now autofill these concatenated passwords on your iOS device. Now, I'll admit, this is kind of a long way to go to solve an otherwise minor annoyance with creating and autofilling these concatenated passwords. It kind of reminds me of this oft-cited comic by XKCD about over-engineering solutions via automation. But I still found the journey to the solution really, really rewarding. What started as a small frustration turned into a valuable deep dive into orchestrating a solution using REST APIs, Apple shortcuts, and 1Password Connect. And to me, the funny thing is that I came up with the solution totally by accident when I was solving another problem, the problem of why 1Password CLI broke all my Keyboard Maestro macros when my internet connection was down. So I think the real takeaway here isn't just that I solved the problem. It's that every time you build something like this, you're expanding your knowledge about the tools and processes that you can use for your next challenge. And I thought that's what was really rewarding about this whole process. And hopefully this helps you as well.